Today we're going to be replacing a brake caliper in a caliper based brake system. This pretty much applies to any car or truck out there that has caliper brakes like these here. I'm going to be showing you how to replace this, how to bleed the brakes, and some tips and tricks along the way. So stay tuned and let's get going. Okay, so we don't need too many things for this job, but before messing with anything to do with brakes, brake fluid, make sure you have brake fluid available. It's very easy to get caught up in a brake job and you forget to buy the fluid. It happens to the best of us. A little bit of anti-seize, you'll see why in a second, and some penetrant because I live in a rust belt. And when you bleed or flush your brakes, I recommend a flush. Then you'll need a second person to help you or a brake bleeding flushing kit. So make sure you have all those things available. The first thing I'm going to do, because I live in a rusty area, is spray some penetrant on some of these bolts here. So I want to spray it on this one right here, which belongs to the kind of slider pin in the top of the brake caliper bracket. So this one here, it's 12 millimeters on mine. It's very hard to see, very rusted. There's also a matching one on the bottom here. And also I want to spray down this bolt here. So that one there, that's the banjo bolt, and that's responsible for connecting the brake line here, the brake hose, to the brake caliper. So I'm going to spray those three down. Okay, 20 minutes later, I'll get my wire brush on there, shake off any loose rust. It's mainly the banjo bolt, to be honest, this one here. Mine's pretty caked in rust. We don't want to round that off. It'll be a nightmare to drill out. If you have a new banjo bolt, that's great, but typically new brake calipers don't come with a banjo bolt, so we just want to make sure we get this off as best as possible. So these two are 12 millimeters on my car. We're going to crack those both open. Okay, so I've cracked these open. They're nice and loose, top and bottom. Don't remove them just yet. We want to keep the caliper in the bracket to keep this sturdy so that when we undo our banjo bolt here, it's going to be a lot easier. The caliper's not flapping everywhere. Okay, so when we open up this banjo bolt, this is a 14 millimeter right here. We're going to need like a little bucket under there to catch any brake fluid that will come out. And because my banjo bolt's nice and rusty, I'm going to just tap it on with a hammer very lightly to break off the rest of the rust that we couldn't get off with the wire brush. Now I recommend removing the banjo bolt first, it's just a lot easier, but I've removed the two 12 millimeter bolts in the sliding pins so I can show you something very interesting and why we should remove brake bleeder screws when compressing pistons and replacing brake pads. Let me show you that real quick. So I've taken out the two 12 millimeter bolts. The brake caliper is going to come free with a little bit of wiggling. So there's the brake caliper. We'll remove our brake pads and get them out of the way. Set them aside and bring the caliper up here. Okay. So before we unbolt the brake line, make sure your brake fluid level is to the maximum. I'm going to be flushing the brakes as part of this job, but even if you're bleeding them, make sure it's at a maximum here before we remove that. We don't want to let this fluid go too low, and then we're going to get air in the master cylinder, and it's going to be a really big ball ache. So we're just going to top this up. Okay, so now I'm just going to remove the banjo bolt. It's finger tight. And let me show you the condition of the brake fluid inside a brake caliper. Let's just take that out. Okay, ready? Now look in the bucket. You see how gray that is? All those metal particles in there? All the nastiness in your brake fluid lives right next to the caliper, and that's why it's very important when you compress this piston not to shove all that in and around your brake system. So, bad science. Okay, so I've just put a bucket under there. That's pretty much gonna drip indefinitely till we bolt it on. So I'm just gonna clean up this with a wire brush. You can actually see on this car anyway, it's a little hoop there. There's a little hole, weep hole. That's where your brake fluid comes down the brake line. And it's quite hard to see, but it's a little indented inside that ring, so the brake fluid almost goes around in a circle, And then if you look at our banjo bolt, the banjo bolt has a hole in it as well. And that's sort of how all that bolts into the caliper and how the brake fluid flows around there. So you'll notice your banjo bolt here will have a gasket here, like a little washer. This is a copper crush gasket. You'll see them on oil drain pans as well when you change the oil. These are designed to be replaced, so your brake caliper, your new one, should come with 2 of these. If it doesn't, make sure you buy them. It's very important. These get crushed and ideally they cannot be reused. So there'll be one here, and then your brake line connects to that, and then on the other side of the brake line here there'll be another gasket. So it's not here, so let's take a look at our old caliper here, and there it is right there. It's sort of pushed in that hole. It's almost like a trick. It looks like it belongs to the caliper, but that is a crush gasket, and it's almost just seized onto the old caliper. So it pretty much goes caliper, copper crush gasket, brake line, copper crush gasket, banjo bolt, in that order, like a sandwich, I guess. So now we're going to assemble everything back together. Okay, so before we assemble it back together, make sure your brake line is free of any debris. We don't want a crush gasket sort of getting stuck between a little bit of rust, and then we can potentially have a leak. So I'm just going to wipe that down with a rag, and then we're going to start assembling. So I was looking at these instructions from Napa here that supplied the new brake caliper, and it says clamp the brake hose. You should never clamp the brake hose on a car. Brake hoses have hard inner walls. You can collapse the interior of the brake hose. You can cause dragging brakes, pistons that don't compress and retract again. It is very bad medicine to clamp one of these. Just fully flush and bleed your brakes afterwards. Get all this nasty stuff out. There's no sense in clamping brake hoses. It's a horrible practice. So I've got my first copper crush gasket on there. I'm just gonna pop that into a nicely cleaned hole there, and then we're going to take our new caliper, remove the plastic sort of retainer there. That's just for the factory, so nothing, you know, inadvertently gets in there. This is probably empty. I don't know if they pre-oil these. Let's take a look. No, nothing in there. And yeah, then we're just gonna bolt this back to our banjo bolt there. The orientation doesn't matter. You might think the hole has to line up with the hole inside. It really doesn't matter, because the internal inner wall there is sort of recessed a little bit, so don't worry about orientation. So we're just going to bolt this back onto the caliper there. I was just looking at this. I love how it says clamp the brake hose and then make sure you didn't destroy it afterwards. If you did, replace it. It's crazy. So torque wrench. I highly recommend a torque wrench on tightening down things like banjo bolts. Very important. You don't want it too loose. You don't want brake fluid to leak. You don't want it too tight, potentially destroy the copper crush washers and have that leak as a result. Terrible. On this car, 30 Newton meters, which in dinosaur units is 21 foot-pounds. So I'm going to get my torque wrench on this and torque it down. Very important, very important. Please get a torque wrench if you don't have one on the banjo bolt right there. So now no more brake fluid's going to leak out of here. I'm just going to spray it down with brake parts cleaner. It evaporates very quickly. Brake fluid, very corrosive. You don't want it on your hands. Bit late for that. Wear gloves, please. You don't want brake fluid on paint, anything like that. So we're just going to spray it all down, get it nice and clean, and then we're going to finish up here. Okay, another tip. Now that's all assembled, I'm going to remove the cap from the brake bleeder screw right there. I'm going to take this out and I'm going to add some anti-seize to it. It is one of the worst things on a car you can ever undo, especially when you live in a rusty environment. They just do not come off. You can get a bit lucky. Sometimes you may not get lucky at all. So it does depend. If you cannot get this out, I'll link a video in the description below which I will show you how to remove these 99% of the time. If you fall in the 1% of people, then I will link a video in the description below where we will attempt to remove this one right here. Okay, so I'm just going to put a bit of anti-seize on the threads here of this bleeder screw. I'm going to go all the way around. Make sure you don't get it in the little weep hole there. We don't really want that mixed in with our brake fluid. There we go. So in all the threads, believe me, you'll thank me later, trust me. Okay, so while we're in here, we might as well check our brake pads, check for uneven wear, weird wear, misalignment, missing pieces, torn boots, lubrication, slider pins that go in and out nicely, brake discs for scoring, warping, pitting, you're already in here, let's check it all. If you want to learn how to replace brake pads, brake discs, CV axles, suspension, everything, I'll link everything in the description below, or you can check out my channel. I have replaced pretty much everything on an entire car. Very useful information. So we're just going to put the brake pads back in here, and we're going to get our caliper bolted back on with our 12mm bolts right here. Make sure when you put your caliper back on, you don't have any clips accidentally coming through the window here. Your abutment clips here have lubrication on and they're present, and then we're going to put our caliper back on. Okay, so what I like to do with these bolts right here, these are the 12mm bolts on the sliding pins, and even suspension components as well, is to use some semi-permanent Loctite. That's the blue one right here. It just means if things vibrate, they're not going to come undone and shake things loose. So just need a small line on there. When we put that in, it's going to slowly, spread out. It's no problem. Then we're just going to pop it back in. Easy, no problem. Okay, so the new caliper is installed, the slide pin bolts are in, the banjo bolt has been torqued down to the correct spec. The only thing left we have to do is get all of the air out of the system. We had this brake hose dangling. This caliper's from the factory, so that has air in there too. So we need to take out this brake bleeder cap right here, which is actually a little bit stubborn, and then bleed the whole system. What I'm going to do, I'm going to couple this with a brake flushing. I'm just going to flush the whole system. So we're just going to remove each wheel off in turn and bleed the brakes in the order set out in the service manual. If you want to know how to bleed the brakes on pretty much any car or truck out there, I'll link a video in the description below. You can check it out and learn how to bleed your brakes with one person or two people. Okay, so because there's so much air in here right now, the first couple bleeds on here, it's just gonna spit out a bit and then it'll start running smoothly. So what I normally do, I usually do this corner first, make sure this is all full with brake fluid, and then I start the complete flush. So, the furthest one away from the master cylinder in order until we get to the one closest to the master cylinder. Depending on the orientation, sometimes that can change if you have ABS, which most of us do these days, so check your service manual just to be sure. Okay, pump. So this bleed is pretty long and my wrench always goes to the end and it just keeps rotating. It's super annoying, so I've just put a couple of washers in there and that's gonna help me a lot with that, and then I can get a secure fit on there every time. So that looks a lot better now. Okay, pump, 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 pump. So now we've flushed the entire brake system, bled the system of air. The job is complete. We have a brand new caliper installed on our car. Pretty cool, isn't it? I hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned, like and subscribe for more videos coming soon. Take care, guys. Thank you for watching.